The wind howled across the prairie as night fell heavy over the rancher's land. Inside his cabin, Samuel Cutter, a man built from years of hardship under sun and storm, was settling down to a quiet supper when the door burst open. A young woman stumbled inside, her face pale, her dress torn by briars and dust, eyes wide with desperation. She clutched his arm with trembling hands and gasped, "He'll kill you!" At first, Cutter thought she might be delirious, some poor soul who had lost her way, but the fear in her eyes was real, raw, like a deer fleeing from a wolf. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other, about a man who hunted her, a man who had already killed and would kill again. Cutter, ever cautious, listened, but asked no quick questions. He could see her body quaking, her lips cracked, from thirst, yet the warning was not for herself. It was for him. The rancher studied her, trying to decide if this was a trap, for outlaws often sent women to soften men like him before a raid. But something about her, the sincerity in her voice, gnawed at him. He offered her water, bread, and a chair by the fire, his weathered face calm though his mind raced. Outside, the coyotes howled, and the sound seemed to carry a promise of danger riding closer with every gust of wind. She finally whispered a name, Cain Maddox, and at that name, Cutter's jaw tightened. Maddox was no stranger. He was a ruthless outlaw whose reputation stretched across counties. Cutter had once heard a man say Maddox carried death in his saddlebag, and any place he rode soon tasted blood. The girl's warning wasn't idle fear, it was prophecy, and by letting her inside his home, Cutter knew he had already stepped onto a dangerous trail that could not be turned back. The following morning, Cutter rose early, the way he always did, but the woman was already awake, sitting silently by the window. In the gray light, she looked less like a victim and more like someone burdened with secrets too heavy to carry. Cutter poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one before her. Her name, she finally said, was Elena Maddox. The name hit Cutter like a hammer strike. She was kin to Cain Maddox, the outlaw whose name spread fear faster than fire across prairie grass. When Cutter asked why she had come, she dropped her eyes to the floorboards. Elena spoke of growing up under Cain's shadow, of how he had once been a brother she admired, before greed and vengeance twisted him. He had lost faith in law, in justice, in humanity itself. His gang terrorized towns, stole cattle, robbed banks, and killed without remorse. But for Elena, blood was still blood, and though she feared him, she carried guilt and sorrow with every mile she put between them. Cutter listened, his weathered hands folded tight around his mug. He'd seen many families torn apart by violence, and her tale was no stranger to the West's cruel reality. But her presence in his home made him a target. He knew it, and so did she. Still, Elena's voice trembled with something more than fear. She had not simply come to run away. She had come because she believed her brother would not stop at chasing her. He would come to Cutter's ranch, and when he did, blood would stain the soil. She wanted to warn him, to spare him, even as she sought a place of safety herself. Cutter studied her again, weighing her words, her honesty, and the risk. Every rancher on the frontier learned early that mercy could be a death sentence, but, as he looked into Elena's tired eyes, he knew he could not turn her out. She was hunted, broken, but still carried the faint spark of someone worth saving. And in that moment, Cutter realized he had chosen his side, even before the first shot was ever fired. The days that followed carried a heavy silence, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Cutter went about his chores, mending fences, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, but his eyes were always drawn to the distant hills. Something about the air felt wrong, too still, too watchful. Helena tried to help where she could, though her nervous glances toward the horizon betrayed her unease. Word traveled fast in the frontier, carried by drifters, traders, and loose-tongued ranch hands. By the 3rd day, whispers reached Cutter's ears. Cain Maddox had been spotted 2 towns over, riding with 6 hard-faced men. They had left behind a saloon with shattered windows, a store in ashes, and a man buried 6 feet deep. Wherever Kane rode, fear lingered like smoke. Neighbors came by with concerned looks, some warning Cutter to stay out of it, others suggesting he turn Elena over before it was too late. "Kane won't stop, Sam," one rancher said. "He'll burn your land, kill your stock, and hang you from your own gate if it means getting what he wants." Cutter listened, but he offered no reply. He was a man who weighed words like bullets, never wasting one unless it mattered. Elena's presence, meanwhile, unsettled more than just Cutter's neighbors. Nights at the ranch grew tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. She carried secrets, and Cutter sensed there was more to her story than fear of her brother. At times, he caught her clutching something hidden in her satchel, eyes glistening with regret. She carried shame like a second shadow. On the 4th evening, Cutter saddled his horse and rode the perimeter of his land. The sunset bled red across the horizon, and in the distance he thought he saw dust clouds rising. Riders. He tightened his grip on the reins. He wasn't a man who went looking for trouble, but trouble had found him all the same. When he returned, Elena was waiting on the porch, her hands folded tight. "He's coming," she whispered, as if she had felt it in her bones. Cutter said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The West was a place where justice and death often came wearing the same face, and Cutter knew that Kane Maddox's shadow was now cast over his home. It was a stormy night when Cutter stumbled upon the secret that would change everything. The wind tore at the shingles, lightning cracked across the plains, and the cattle bellowed uneasily. He went to the barn to check on the stock, lantern in hand, when his boot struck something buried in straw. Bending down, Cutter tugged at a blood-stained cloth, stiff and dark from old wounds. His chest tightened as he pulled it free, and beneath it he discovered a small wooden box. Inside lay a revolver, polished but cold, and a folded paper marked with Kane Maddox's rough scrawl. Cutter's breath caught. The cloth wasn't just any rag. It was a bandana, torn and stained with blood. The initial stitched into its corner, CM, left no doubt whose it was. Kane's. But what was it doing hidden in his barn? And why had Elena never mentioned it? His lantern light flickered as thunder shook the rafters. For a long moment, Cutter simply stood there, staring at the grim evidence in his hands. The woman he had chosen to protect wasn't just Kane's sister. She had brought Kane's shadow into his very home. Elena appeared in the doorway, pale as the lightning that flashed behind her. Her eyes widened when she saw what Cutter held. The truth spilled from her then, words torn from her like confession before judgment. The cloth, the revolver, the note, they were remnants of her brother's descent into darkness. She had taken them when she fled, not as trophies, but as proof of what he had become. "I wanted to burn them," she said, tears streaking her cheeks, "but I couldn't. Part of me still hoped he could be saved." Cutter felt the weight of her sorrow, but also the danger it carried. Keeping Kane's bloodied token was like carrying a wolf's tooth. It was a mark of loyalty and betrayal, all at once. By lifting that cloth, Cutter had uncovered more than a secret. He had uncovered a storm that could not be stopped. As the barn shook with the storm outside, Cutter knew one truth with painful clarity. Kane Maddox was coming, and when he arrived, the past Elena carried would ignite a fire that could consume them all. The storm had passed, but the air inside the cabin was heavier than the thunder that had rolled over the hills. Cutter sat at the table, the blood-stained cloth spread before him. Elena stood across from him, her hands gripping the edge of the wood as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. She had confessed the truth, but Cutter wanted more than fragments. He wanted the whole story. His eyes, sharp as steel, pinned her down until she finally broke the silence. Her voice trembled, but the words came steady enough to cut deep. Kane Maddox had not always been a monster. He had once been a kind brother, a young man with dreams of owning land, of carving out a place under the endless sky. But everything had changed after betrayal came from the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. A greedy sheriff and a handful of corrupt deputies had stolen Kane's herd, beat him near to death, and laughed as they left him for dead. Kane survived, but he did not forgive. Vengeance had burned into him like branding iron, on flesh. He gathered men like himself, outcasts, drifters, broken souls, and forged them into a gang that answered to no law but Cain's rage. Elena had watched the change slowly consume him, until the brother she had loved became a stranger she feared. The cloth Cutter had found was more than blood-stained. It was a reminder of the night Cain crossed a line he could never return from. Elena had been there hiding in the shadows when Cain shot the sheriff point blank in the middle of town. Blood had spilled across Cain's bandana, and Elena had taken it after, unable to leave behind the proof of how far he'd fallen. Tears streaked her face as she confessed she had run not only from Cain's wrath but from her own guilt. She had never spoken a word against him, never tried to stop him, too afraid of losing the only family she had left. But now, Cain was hunting her, and Cutter was tangled in the snare. Cutter sat silent, his jaw set. He had seen men ruined by vengeance before, but this was different. This was blood against blood, family torn apart. He felt the weight of Elena's sorrow, but also the danger of her presence. Protecting her meant declaring war on Cain Maddox. Finally, Cutter spoke, his voice low and steady. "Your brother's made his bed in hell, Elena. Question is, are you ready to walk away from him, or are you just waiting for someone else to fall in with him?" Her eyes glistened, but her answer was firm. "I want to be free, Sam, but I can't do it alone." And with those words, Cutter understood that his quiet life as a rancher was over. The past Elena carried had found him, and now it demanded blood. The prairie dawn broke golden, but inside Cutter's heart shadows loomed. He rose before the sun, stepping outside to breathe the cold morning air. His land stretched wide before him. The corral, the cattle grazing near the river, the weather-worn barn. This was his life, carved with sweat and grit. But now, every fence post, every hoofprint, every blade of grass was threatened by Cain Maddox's coming storm. Elena stepped onto the porch, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The sight of her, fragile yet defiant, stirred something inside him. He had been alone for so long, content with silence and hard work. But now, her presence reminded him of what was at stake. Not just land, but life, dignity, and perhaps something. Or Cutter's thoughts turned to choices. The simplest path would be to turn Elena over, send her riding away before Cain arrived. It might save his skin and spare his land, but it would damn his conscience. Another option was to ride out himself. Find Cain before Cain found him, but that would be a death wish. Cain rode with men enough to cut down any lone fighter. The last choice was the hardest, to stand, to defend his home and the woman under his roof, no matter the odds. It was the path of blood, and Cutter knew the ground outside his ranch might soon drink it deep. Elena, sensing his turmoil, spoke softly. "If I stay, you'll die for me. If I leave, he'll still hunt you. Cain doesn't forget. He doesn't forgive." Her words cut sharp, but they also cleared the fog in Cutter's mind. The truth was, Cain Maddox wasn't just her problem anymore. He was a threat to the whole frontier. Every rancher, every town, every soul who dared to stand free of his iron grip was in danger. Cutter set his jaw, his weathered hand resting on the revolver at his side. "I've spent my life keeping my head down," he said, voice low. "But there comes a time when a man has to decide if he's going to live quiet or die right." The decision was made. Cutter would not run and he would not bend. He would meet Cain Maddox head-on even if it cost him everything. Elena's eyes welled, but in them flickered something new. Hope. She knew Cutter wasn't just protecting her. He was standing against the storm her brother had become. And for the first time in years, she believed there might be light at the end of the blood-soaked trail. The heat of late afternoon clung heavy over the land, the kind that made even the cicadas fall silent. Cutter stood on the porch, his rifle resting against the wall beside him, scanning the horizon. He had spent years learning to read the land, the tilt of dust, the way birds scattered, the sudden silence of the prairie. And now, all the signs told him the same thing. Riders were coming. Elena felt it too. She stayed close to the window, her eyes fixed on the rolling hills as though expecting her brother to emerge at any moment. The air was thick with dread. Neither of them spoke, but words weren't needed. Both knew Kane Maddox was drawing near. By sundown, a neighbor rode in fast, his horse lathered with sweat. His face was pale, his voice urgent. Kane's men were seen just 5 miles out. He's got at least 8 with him, maybe more. They're headed straight this way. Cutter thanked the man and sent him off before Kane could catch his trail. When he turned back, Elena's face was ashen. Her brother was closer than ever, and now there was no time left for choices. Night fell hard and fast. In the distance, campfires sparked on the ridgeline, small points of orange against the dark. Kane Maddox was announcing himself, daring Cutter to stand against him. It was intimidation, pure and deliberate, a promise that come dawn, blood would spill. Inside, Cutter cleaned his revolvers and laid out cartridges in neat rows on the table. Elena sat across from him, her hands shaking as she tried to thread bullets into a Winchester's magazine. Cutter noticed and quietly took over, his hands steady where hers trembled. "You could still ride," he said, voice quiet but firm. "Take the South Trail. Lose yourself before he gets here." Elena shook her head, her eyes blazing. "Running only drags death with me. If Kane wants me, then let it end here." For the first time, Cutter saw not just fear, but fire in her eyes. She wasn't the same trembling woman who had stumbled into his cabin. She was someone ready to face the truth, even if it destroyed her. The night dragged long, restless and thick with tension. Cutter sat awake, staring at the horizon where Kane's fires burned. He knew the dawn would bring a reckoning, and by its end the land would remember this fight in blood. The West didn't allow for cowards, and Cutter had chosen his path. He was ready. Dawn crept slow and cruel, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson. Cutter rose before the first light touched the land, his revolvers holstered and rifle slung across his back. The air was deathly still. Even the cattle seemed to sense the storm about to break. Kane Maddox arrived with the rising sun, riding tall in the saddle, his black hat pulled low, a cruel grin cutting across his weather-worn face. Behind him rode his gang, 8 men hard as iron, rifles glinting in the early light. Dust rose around them like a halo of doom. Cutter stepped out from the porch, calm but unyielding, his boots grinding in the dirt. Elena stood inside, clutching, the Winchester, her knuckles white. She could see Kane's face clearly now, and her heart twisted. He was her brother, but he was also the devil made flesh. Kane's voice carried across the yard, deep and mocking. "Sam Cutter, you've got something of mine. Send my sister out, and maybe I'll let you die quick." Cutter's reply was steady, his voice like steel on stone. "She ain't yours anymore. You'll have to take her from me." The tension snapped like a whip. Guns roared, thunder rolling across the plains. Maddox's men spread wide, firing from horseback. Cutter dove for cover by the corral, his rifle barking flame. The first outlaw toppled from the saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Elena fired from the cabin window, the kick of the Winchester rattling her shoulder. She struck another rider, sending him crashing into the dust. Fear coursed through her veins, but she fought it down. This was survival. This was justice. The ranch became a battlefield. Bullets chewed through wood. Glass shattered. Horses screamed. Cutter moved with practiced precision, each shot measured, each step calculated. But the odds were grim. The gang outnumbered him, and with every passing minute, the walls of his world closed in tighter. At last the chaos narrowed to silence, broken only by the click of revolvers. Kane Maddox dismounted, stepping forward slow and steady. The gang was broken, bodies scattered in the dirt, but Kane himself still stood tall, revolver in hand, eyes burning with hatred. It was time. Brother against protector, blood against honor. The final fight was here. The air was thick with gunpowder and dust, a silence heavy enough to press against the chest. The ranch was littered with the bodies of Kane's men, some still twitching where they had fallen. Horses bolted across the plains, riderless and wild-eyed. And in the center of it all stood Kane Maddox, revolver drawn, his boots crunching slow over the blood-soaked earth. Cutter stepped forward, his own revolver in hand, battered and bleeding from a graze across his side. Every breath came with fire, but his eyes never wavered. This was the moment the West always seemed to lead to, the inevitable clash between men too stubborn to bow. Kane sneered, his voice a low growl. "You think you've done something here, Cutter? All you've done is dig your own grave. You can't protect her. She's mine. Always has been." From the porch, Elena cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "I'm not yours, Kane, not anymore. You lost me the day you sold your soul to vengeance." Kane's eyes flickered just for a heartbeat, but then the sneer returned. "Blood's thicker than any vow, sister. Don't fool yourself, though why?" Two men faced each other, revolvers heavy in their hands, the dawn light casting long shadows between them. The duel was unspoken, but inevitable. Kane drew first, his shot whistling past Cutter's ear. Cutter's hand moved like lightning, his bullet finding flesh. Kane staggered, clutching his chest, yet somehow stayed on his feet. He stumbled toward Elena, his revolver slipping from his fingers. She ran to him, tears streaming, catching him as his knees buckled. For all his cruelty, for all his sins, Kane was still her brother, and watching him fall ripped her apart. Kane's voice was ragged, every word dragged through blood. I thought I could burn it all down, make the world pay, but it was me that paid, wasn't it?" His eyes, dimming now, met hers with something almost like sorrow. Don't follow me, Lena. Live free." His last breath rattled out, his body going limp in her arms. For a long moment silence reigned. Elena clutched him close, sobs racking her frame, while Cutter stood watch, his face carved from stone. Kane Maddox was gone, and with him ended a trail of blood and vengeance that had stretched too long across the frontier. But the cost was heavy, and the land itself seemed to mourn. The sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the battered ranch. The smoke cleared, the echoes of gunfire faded, and for the first time in days, the land seemed to breathe again. But the scars remained, on the soil, on the walls, and in the hearts of those who had survived. Cutter stood among the wreckage, weary but unbroken. His home bore bullet holes, the corral was half ruined, and blood stained the dirt. But he was alive. More than that, he had held his ground. He had chosen to fight, and he had not bent under the storm. Elena buried her brother with her own hands, digging a grave on the far edge of the ranch where the wild grass grew tall. Cutter helped, in silence, giving her space for grief. It was not forgiveness, not really, but it was closure. Kane Maddox had lived by the gun and died by it, and now he rested in the earth, his vengeance finally ended. When the grave was filled, Elena stood staring at it, the wind tugging at her hair. She whispered something Cutter could not hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a farewell. Then she turned back to the ranch, her eyes red but steadier than they had been in years. The days that followed were slow but healing. Cutter rebuilt fences, patched walls, and tended his cattle. Elena stayed, helping where she could, her hands learning the rhythm of ranch life. There was sorrow between them, yes, but also something unspoken, something that might one day grow into more. Cutter often found himself watching her when the sun dipped low, the firelight catching her face. She was no longer the frightened stranger who had stumbled into his cabin. She was stronger now, tempered by pain but unbroken, just like the land itself. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, Cutter lifted his hat and gazed across the endless plains. The sky was painted in streaks of red and gold, a promise of tomorrow. Elena stood beside him, her hand brushing his. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with fear. It was filled with hope. The West had taken much from them both, but it had also given them a second chance. And in that quiet moment, as the prairie wind whispered through the grass, Samuel Cutter knew one truth. The past was buried, the storm had passed, and before them stretched a new dawn.